And Camp, how's it going? This is Justin Gibney, president of the AND campaign, and this is another Civic update where we are trying to raise civic literacy among Christians so that as we go out into the public square, we can engage society in a more informed and effective manner. And so today I want to talk a little bit about the migrant crisis and a plan called Remain in Mexico. Remain in Mexico. As many of you have heard, I'm sure, on Sunday, a major port of entry on the U.S. and Mexican border was shut down temporarily, and during that shutdown, all kinds of chaos just broke out. You had migrants, many of whom were from the caravan from Central America that we heard so much about, at least during the midterms, didn't hear much about it afterwards. But that situation got out of control. Apparently, many of these migrants were really upset because the asylum process at the border was just taking too long. And so once this port got shut down, chaos broke out. The Mexican police could not contain the crowd. And so that at that point, when things got out of control, the U.S. agents ended up firing tear gas at some of these people. A really bad and unfortunate situation that got out of hand and probably was avoidable if we had the policy, a comprehensive immigration policy, and if we were prepared for what was going on. But it's a really sad situation around Tijuana at the border. Our facilities just aren't sufficient to even hold most of these people. So what we're seeing is a growing humanitarian crisis, and it's getting worse and worse, and we need to figure this out. I think there are over 5,000 people from this caravan that are still trying to get across this border around Tijuana, and something needs to happen because this is going to continue to get worse until we really deal with this issue in a real way. One of the things that we have to realize too is when this happened on Sunday, I was listening to NPR today, they made a really good point that America, depending on what side of the political divide you are on, saw two different things. If you are a Trump supporter, what you saw was migrants rushing or invading the border, and that's what's going to stick in your head. But if you're a Trump critic, really what you saw was women and children getting tear gassed. That's the image that's going to stick in your head. And so when you try to have a conversation about it, when you're seeing two totally different things and there's no common ground, it's hard to have a constructive conversation in that regard. The truth of the matter is both of those things happened, and both of those things were preventable if we were better prepared for what was going on down there. Unfortunately, we were not. Now, to be clear, the U.S. law and even international law allows for protection of asylum seekers. And so that's what these people are trying to get at, this protection as they're seeking asylum. The issue that we're seeing is that there's a process to get asylum, and there should be a process. There has to be some kind of standard to make sure that people actually fit the definition of asylum seekers. So we understand there's a process, but the process is taking months. And so think about if you are a migrant and you're in a desperate situation, you have kids, you have a lot of stuff going on, for it to take months for you to get through would probably be very frustrating. And so from my understanding, these people got extremely frustrated and things got out of hand. I'm not going to say that it was okay for people to rush the border in the way that they did. However, we should be able to understand, especially as Christians, the desperation that some of these people are in. And as a government, the U.S. government needs to find ways to put ourselves in a position not to have to resort to the tactics, that we resorted to on Sunday. It just was not a good look, and it's hopefully something that we can avoid moving forward. Now, when it comes to this border crisis and asylum issue, the Trump administration's response, their first response was actually to try to put in measures to make it harder to seek asylum. And a federal judge had to step in and block those measures. So that was the first thing that they did. And then the other day, President Trump said that he was okaying the use of lethal force on the border, as a response to what was going on. Now, thankfully, Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis pushed back against the idea of using lethal force on the border. It just is not necessary. But when people say we need to be more humane, because someone kind of got at the AND campaign about us not being fair to the Trump administration in this regard, but when people are saying that we're not being humane, that's what they're talking about. When you're talking about using lethal force and you haven't even employed some of the other alternatives to that, when we know that there are women and children at the border, something has to change. And so the question that I think we need to ask is, how do we move forward? How do we do a better job and prevent this from happening? As Americans, we should all be holding our government to a pretty high standard to say, are we handling this in the best way possible? No, our resources aren't inexhaustible, right? No, we don't have the facilities that maybe we should have, and there are resource issues down there, and it's not as easy and as clean as it always looks. We need to understand that. But we got to make sure that we're doing as much as we can to avoid those situations. Now, that's my main concern. That said, I think there is room for improvement, if we're being honest, from Mexico and also parts of Central America to partner and handle these situations better. At the end of the day, how can the U.S., Mexico, and these parts of Central America that people are running from, how can we make this situation better? The first thing we might want to work together and do is make sure that there isn't such a need for people to seek asylum. Is there anything we can do to make the situation in those areas, or anything Mexico can do or Central America can do to make sure the situation in those areas isn't at a place where there's so many people seeking asylum and really overwhelming the system that just really wasn't built for this level of people coming in and seeking asylum. One thing that I can say that's somewhat promising is Mexico's interior minister announced that he's actually in conversations and negotiations with the U.S. government for a plan called Remain in Mexico. And the plan really is for us to come together with Mexico and really work on making sure that there isn't so much pressure on our asylum system. There isn't so many people coming to the system, and us collaborating to make sure that's happening. So I think we should all pay attention to how this Remain in Mexico plan goes, and hopefully we can move that forward. But none of this erases the fact, and every time I talk about immigration, I talk about this, that the United States needs comprehensive immigration reform. So that when people go to the border, they know what to expect, they know how everything's going to move forward, and we're not just coming up with stuff as we go along. We're not just saying, hey, let's make it harder today, easier tomorrow. Hey, let's tear gas them today or do this. No, we have a plan for how to handle it. Unfortunately, we have not been able to get this done. And until we get that done, we have to do everything we can to make sure that we are humane. And I think this administration has not done a good job of making sure that we have a humane policy down there. And with that said, I will also say that these far left ideas of open borders and getting rid of ICE are just not realistic. And you can even talk to some people who have been in immigration, who've been immigration advocates for a long time, that say, look, I'm progressive, but where we're going with this conversation doesn't make sense because open borders isn't a policy. It's nothing that a responsible group of legislators are really going to push through. So what you're doing when you push a policy that's that far, that's that extreme, is you really make sure that we don't get to solutions at all because you're not coming to the table in a reasonable manner. So we need comprehensive immigration reform. We need folks on the right to think about being humane, and some of them are. We need folks on the left to say, hey, it needs to be reasonable and not just go with what makes the best narrative. So these are some things that we can work on. We're not saying that it's necessarily equivalent, that both sides are equally liable for what's going on down there. But if there's something both sides can do better, then they need to do that. So we can be reasonable and we can actually help these people instead of having this ongoing fight that people can use here and there to help their politics or get their base fired up. These are human beings that need help, and we need to do what we can do to make it better. If you like this conversation, you can always listen to the Church Politics Podcast with myself and Michael Ware, where we go in depth on issues like this all the time, and we would love to have you as a listener. Until the next time, be focused on what we can do and how we can push our representatives to do something about this border crisis. Take care, and camp.